Hello, and welcome to the final lecture of the term. Uh, it's at this point that I would like to congratulate you on just how much you really have achieved. I mean, think all the way back to the beginning of the course when you probably had absolutely no idea what in the world was in store for you, and just take a look at where you are now. And that's a real achievement, and you should feel good. However, you should also understand that this is just your first step into a larger world. That a first course in logic is just that. It's a first course, and it does only a small amount of the things that are possible. And so this last lecture is not, I want to say, is not tested material. So don't think, oh my gosh, I've got to worry about recreating one of Gödel's proofs. No, okay. But I think it would be irresponsible of me not to inform you of how much more and there really is available in logic, and what some of that stuff is like to sort of feed your interest and your curiosity. So here's some of the rest of that. There's much more, okay, than even we've seen so far. So the first thing I want to cover are other things, right, that we can add to our quantified predicate logic. Right now, we started off with predicates, and we added quantifiers, and then we added the identity predicate, and then we added functions, right? And you can continue adding several other things, and that's one of the first things I wanted to just sort of talk about a little bit. So one of the things you can add to logic is something called modality, right? And modal logic, at least in the 20th century, is sort of most things resembling modal logics have been around for a long time. But modal logic in the 20th century is most prominently pioneered by this fella in this picture here. This is Sol Kripke, very, very important figure in the history of logic. And yeah, there he is. And so what modality does is it adds two new operators to our quantified predicate logic. In the most straightforward of those systems of modal logic, we call it the K system, or K semantics, and the K is for Kripke here. And so in that system, the square, right, is the symbol for necessity, and the diamond symbol is the symbol for possibility. Okay, and so we get some examples of that include something like if we have the ordinary predicate logic expression Vader is Luke's father, right? You can say like if F is the predicate, blank is the father of blank, right? Then you just say F VL, right? You could also do this with a function, right? But either way. We can say that it is not the case that Vader is Luke's father. We can say that Vader can't be Luke's father. Okay, this is where modality comes in. This notion of like can't be, right? We could just build that into a predicate, but if there's an argument that really sort of centers around these sort of ideas of necessity and possibility, we got to use an operator for that. And so if you look. Well, it's just not wanting to. There we go. There are my pointer options. I'm trying to get my laser pointer. It wasn't giving me the menu. Okay, here we go. So if you take a look and parse this out, it is not the case that it is possible. Remember, this is the symbol for possibility. So it is not the case that it is possible that Vader is the father of Luke, right? And an alternate way of expressing that is it is necessary, right, that it is not the case that Vader is the father of Luke. Okay, so those are both ways. Those are equivalent ways of saying that Vader can't be Luke's father. Not just that he isn't, right? That he can't be, right? And that's what modal logic is for. We could say the opposite. We could say that Vader has to be Luke's father. We could say it is necessary that Vader is the father of Luke. Or we can say it is not possible that it is not the case that Vader is the father of Luke. And you'll see there's this equivalence relationship between the necessity operator and the possibility operator that's very much the same for our quantifiers, right? So you remember the universal quantifier is equivalent to not existential not, and the existential is equivalent to not universal not, right? And so actually the same thing, oddly, not oddly, but interestingly applies to the modal operators. And but there are many kinds of modal logic, right? The case system where we're talking about necessity and possibility is one of those, probably the most common. But you can have other kind of modal logics that have other kind of operators, or that even borrow these symbols and add, sort of define them differently. You could talk about a deontic logic, right? So if you're talking about wanting to put things like moral commands or moral rules into a logical system, you can then have an operator for it is obligatory that, an operator for it is permitted that, right? So there's a difference between what you have to do and what you're allowed to do but don't have to do. And of course, there's a difference between that stuff and the stuff that you're forbidden to do, morally speaking. And so, for various kinds of semi-autonomous and autonomous systems that are expected to follow certain kind of moral rules, or rules, just rules of any kind, I mean, even legal rules, right? Then you could use what's called a deontic logic. The word deontic means regarding duty, right? Temporal logics, okay? This is where sometimes people call these tense logics. The idea is that it takes into account, sort of time, okay, actually, and so some of that grammar is sometimes necessary for arguments. So something like it will be the case that, or will always be the case that, or just it will be the case that. Notice that's different, right? It has always been the case that versus it was the case that, right? And if you allow that, like something like time travel is possible, then you have like 1,000 tenses or something like that. That's the joke. The hardest part about time travel is the grammar that you're supposed to use for when you are about to having done something that you did and will do at a later but earlier time, right? So stuff like that. What tense do you use for that? So because there's also doxastic logic, right? That is logic about beliefs, or not just about beliefs, although the word doxastic means about belief. But there are also other kinds of logics for intentional, for what were called propositional attitudes, right? That is the attitudes that we have toward propositions, and that's a way of representing some of that stuff. So like I said, you can take a lot of the nuances in the way that we talk and the way that we refer to things, and sometimes it requires some very specialized tools in a logical formalism, whereas other kinds of arguments, many kinds of everyday arguments and sets of statements don't require a lot of specialized machinery. But just know that specialized machinery does exist and is there, and that's a sampling of it. So one of the other things that can be done to really add to our system of logic is that you can make alterations to some of the central assumptions of logic itself, right? And this is this is sort of crazy cool, right? And what we call that is we call that non-classical logic. So far we've only been talking about classical logic, right? And what makes it classical is that it follows the classical logical rules. The classical logical rules are these, that we've covered these. The law of excluded middle, that is that all propositions are either true or false. Okay, this is the law that makes something like P or not P a tautology. Also, there is the law of non-contradiction, that is no proposition is both true and false. Okay, that's the law that makes not P and not P a tautology, or the rule that makes P and not P a contradiction. So that's those are fundamental. Sometimes people add a law of identity, that just P is P or something like that. And I don't know. I think that the reason that that's a law is because its negation is a contradiction. So anyway, but yeah, these are the rules of classical logic. So imagine denying one of these rules for some reason, and you can get kind of a non-classical logic. So the analogy here is it's just like denying one of Euclid's axioms about geometry yields a different non-Euclidean geometry, right? So denying one or both of these laws yields what's called a non-classical logic. Now, the alert listener at this point will say, wait a second. Why in the world would anybody deny these, right? Didn't we say early in the term that the reason these get to be laws of logic is not, these are discovered, not invented, right? Because it's just so they're just so bleeding obvious. Nothing could be more obvious than these sorts of things. That everything either has to be true or false, right? If I say this pen is blue, I'm either right or I'm wrong about that, right? Etc. Right? Or that especially the law of non-contradiction. How's it? It seems like the very definition of rationality is saying something about non-contradiction. So how would we deny these? Well, that's a complicated story, and that the complicated story starts with talking about something like gaps. Okay, So a gap is the name for the idea that in some cases, some propositions can be neither true nor false, right? That is that some propositions violate the law of excluded middle, right? Such things are called in the literature, especially if you look at, say, Graham Priest. And I'll have to say Graham Priest's a really excellent book, Introduction to Non-Classical Logic, is an invaluable resource to anybody who wants to do anything with non-classical logic for any purpose. It's fantastic, and you know, so much more fantastic than anything else I can think of that's available. That's what I'm going to sort of recommend. So the idea is this: if there's a lot of different reasons for that you might go for gaps or think that there really are gaps. So first off, if you subscribe to a theory of truth, right, that is other than a correspondence theory of truth, such as a verificationist theory of truth, then some sentences which can neither be confirmed nor denied will be neither true nor false. This is fairly technical, and I'll try and explain it very briefly. The idea is that we've been operating with more or less a correspondence theory of truth. We say that what makes the sentence "the cat is on the mat" true is that there's a state of the world, right? Namely, there's a cat on the mat, right? And since the sentence matches up with the state of the world, then you know or the proposition anyway, the proposition that the sentence expresses matches the state of the world. That proposition is true, and so the sentence that expresses it then is by extension true, right? Or some story of that kind, right? That's essentially the way that we've been talking about this. There are other ideas about truth. I personally think they're kind of, well, I want to say silly. I think they're wrong. They're not silly, but I think they are wrong. And I think the verificationist idea is one of those. It says, okay, look, what we mean by true or false, so goes the theory, is as we mean, you know, can be verified or something like that. To me, that mixes up the concept of truth and the concept of justification, which I think are two different things. But again, it is a view. And so if you had that view, right, this verificationist view, this view that says that true means can be proven, right, or is proven essentially, right, not just can be, but is, and you know, false means is disproven or something like that, then of course you'll have some things that can be neither confirmed nor denied, right? You know, such as or at least can practically not be confirmed or denied, right? So in such cases, then you might have gaps, but we don't have to sort of alter our fundamental notion of truth for gaps. There might be other kinds of things that would count as gaps, even in a more conventional mode of thinking about truth. So one would be something like failure of denotation. So remember this, the sentence, Santa Claus wears a red suit, okay? Well, of course, Santa Claus doesn't exist. I'm, again, sorry to spoil that for anybody who's watching. But the idea is that how can something that doesn't exist wear a red suit or not wear a red suit, right? That's the idea. It's like, you know, how can you say something about something that doesn't exist? And so you might want to say, look, if you're talking about something that doesn't exist, we're just going to say that can't be either true or false, right? Because it makes just as little sense to say, no, it's true that Santa Claus wears a red suit, than to say, no, Santa Claus does not wear a red suit, right? So again, do we want to say of something that doesn't exist that it does not wear a red suit, that it has a property of that kind? I don't know, right? Perhaps category mistakes, right? You might simply say, look, it's simply false that Aristotle is a prime number because Aristotle doesn't fit the definition of prime number. But you might just say, look, this sentence doesn't sufficiently, you know, it's different than just false. It's this sort of neither. It's like, how do you tell whether something is or isn't a prime number if it's not even a number, right? So I don't know. I tend to just think that such sentences are false, but you might say that category mistakes are one area in which you want to say, no, those are the kinds of things that, you know, they just don't even rise to the level of being true or false or something like that. You could have statements on the borders of vague terms, okay, such as that, you know, this is actually one that is a thing that people are talking more about in a lot of ways, whether or not viruses are alive, right? So if you have a biologist say, okay, what counts as a living thing, and then ask them about viruses, they're going to always say, well, that's a gray area, right? It fits some of the criteria that we usually apply to say that something's a living thing, and it violates other criteria of you know, and so what do you want to say about it? It's this sort of quasi, you know, it's a strange case, viruses are. And so the idea is that you might say that such as, you know, such cases just really are neither true nor false because they're sort of on the border of these vague terms. So saying something like, you know, George Costanza is bald, right? You know, it's like, well, he's certainly balding, you know, George Costanza being the character in Seinfeld played by Jason Alexander. but you want to say, well, he does have hair, so it's not like he's just completely bald, right? He's balding. I don't know you might say that's a kind of vague case. And if you don't think that case is vague, give him a few more hairs, right? Give him one more hair and one more hair and one more hair until you're like, gosh, I don't know. Right. And then the statement is just in this sort of, gray area. So that's, again, a motivation. Somebody might want to say, look, there are areas in which we just want to say it's neither true nor false, right? So, for example, me, who is very near the average height for, an American male, you might say, is he tall? It's like, well, I mean, you don't want to say obviously not or obviously am or I don't know, right? But, again, if you think it's clear, add or subtract a little bit of my height until you get to a point where you're like, I don't know, right? Also, future contingents, right? There's a question about these, okay? So if somebody says the first pope of the 22nd century will be Chinese, well, no, look, there's a fact of the matter, right? But of course, someone might say, look, the fact of the matter doesn't exist yet. So if the truth maker of some claim like this doesn't exist yet, then I think we have to say that the claim itself is neither true nor false, right? And I sort of think, no, it is true or false. It's just that we won't know whether it's true or false until much later. But again, you might use a sentence like this one as a motivation for accepting gaps, right? So these are all sorts of things that people might point to, and they're not stupid, right? And so if we want to talk about having people who've done a lot of work with the logic of gaps, and we can look at this fellow here. We'll talk about this fellow here in a second. So the idea is that if a proposition can be neither true nor false, that is, be a gap, then we have to have a logic that supplies values for true propositions. That's what the T is going to indicate. False propositions, that's what the F is going to indicate, and then gaps, right? So G in this case stands for gappy, right? And so one kind of a three-valued logic with gaps is called K3, right? And so this is not K for Kripke, this is K for clean, and the 3 is for three-valued logic, named after this fellow here. That is Stephen Cole Clean, who's a mathematician, logician, again, another important, fairly important figure in logic. Maybe not so much as Kripke, but maybe that's just, bias in terms of what I learned about. I'm in philosophy, so, Kripke's a bigger deal in philosophy than Clean is. I suppose if you're a mathematician, you'd be like, Krip who, right? Maybe, I don't know. So yeah. And so again, here is what K3 does to our truth tables. And remember, we have to have a three-valued logic instead of a two-valued logic with just true false. We have T, F, and G, G for gappy, okay? And so here's a truth table for all that, right? And so we have, P, which again has to have three truth values. It's either true or gappy or false. And Q, which while P is true, Q can be true or gappy or false. And while P is gappy, Q can be true, gappy, or false. And while P is false, Q can be true, gappy, or false. So this is just another way of doing a truth table by very standard rules, and it's just extended. And so the idea is that we have, so the negation, right? This is how it works. You take, if something is true, okay, then it comes out as false if you negate it. If something is false, comes out as true when you negate it. That's familiar enough. When something is gappy and you negate it, it's still gappy. If it's neither true nor false and you say not that thing, it's also neither true nor false. And so if you say something like, the first pope of the 22nd century will be Chinese, if that's neither true nor false, then saying the first pope of the 22nd century will not be Chinese, it doesn't seem like it should be any more true or false. So again, negation of a gappy proposition is a gappy proposition. And so the or, interestingly, works in some familiar ways. And so if P is true, well, then, P or whatever is going to be true. So whatever P is true, then, P or whatever is true. It doesn't matter on the other thing there, okay? And so when Q is true, right, the whole thing does come out to be. Now, when P and Q are both gappy, well, so is this thing. It's gappy, right? So you want to say two things that are neither true nor false and connect them with an or. It doesn't seem like you've gotten anywhere, right? Same thing here, right? If it's at least gappy, if it's sort of at best gappy and at worst false, right? On one side, it stays gappy, right? And so that's the idea here. And so it's going to be false, of course, if both are false, right? So the or is going to work in some conventional ways, but just adding these gaps along in there. The and is going to be kind of the inverse, right? It's going to be true only if both are true, and it's going to be gappy if one of them's gappy, right? Or simply false if one of them's false. Okay, and that's or even both false. Right? And then of course there's the conditional, and we'll talk about the conditional and how it works here in a bit. So here's some of the interesting things that K3 semantics will bring with it, right? And this is the real fun of non-classical logics. Okay, so in K3, right, the law of excluded middle is not a tautology. Okay, so P or not P. That's not a tautology in K3 semantics, right? This is not a surprise, okay, because it's the acceptance of gaps that motivates the new semantics. The whole point in having K3 semantics was to like say, well, law of excluded middle doesn't always apply. And so, of course, it can't be a tautology in the system. There are no tautologies in K3 though, and we're like, oh, that sucks. That's annoying, right? So this has bothered some logicians, of course, and I think it should, right? So for example, K3 can be fixed, right? You can sort of modify it a little bit to deliver at least some logical truths, right? For example, in order to get the law of identity, okay, that is the law that makes if P then P a tautology, okay, you have to change the truth function of the conditional in the following way, right? So if you look here, if you see in the case in which P and Q are both gappy, and it comes out as gappy in K3, um, it said if you change that to be that gappy comes out as true, right? If gappy then gappy, right? Then you have a different kind of system, okay, that changes the system. We're no longer in K3 semantics. Instead, we're in this character here is called L with bar, right? So I'll say L with bar 3 semantics after Jan Łukasiewicz, and if somebody who's actually Polish is gonna just sort of like face plant, shake their head, right? But again, I did not grow up as an infant making any of those sounds or hearing any of those sounds. So anyway, but yeah, my approximation of how to pronounce this particular Polish name is Łukasiewicz. Okay. There you go. And that's a picture of this fellow here, right, from kind of a long time ago, really. So again, people have been working with some of these non-classical logics for quite some time, but usually somewhat out of the mainstream of what most people do with logic. And so anyway, this system will save, okay, the law of identity, for example, and so that still comes out as a tautology in this system. But of course, the law of excluded middle doesn't, and you can do all sorts of interesting things with it. So those are gaps. But you might say that instead of gaps, really you're interested in gluts, okay? So a glut is the name for this idea that a sentence can be both true and false, okay? And thus violate the law of non-contradiction. So another way of having a non-classical logic is instead of denying the law of excluded middle, to deny the law of non-contradiction, right? And again, why would anyone want to do such a thing? Well, look, there's some things that are not stupid that somebody might say. So you might talk about, like, if you want to talk about a system with inconsistent laws, for example, you may say, so for example, if one law is no males have the right to vote, right, and then some other law says all property owners have the right to vote, doesn't take a lot of imagination to say, okay, what about a male property owner? Now what? And so you want to say, look, in this system, in this context, it is both true and false that that person has the right to vote. If you just want to talk about that in a matter-of-fact way, I guess you'd have to have a system that had gluts in it. Even though, notice, such a system doesn't require you to say, no, there are things that really are contradictions and things that really are both true and false. I don't know. It's an interesting story. If you want to talk about actually inconsistent rules, there's a really excellent article written in a compilation of articles called Philosophy in Baseball. But one of these is written by a logician who sort of, noticed something a little bit funny in the rules of Major League Baseball, where I think everyone who's played a little bit of like playground baseball knows the adage tie goes to the runner, right? So the idea is that if the ball and the runner arrive at the base at the same time, that the runner is safe, okay? So because as they say, tie goes to the runner. Now that's not actually in the rules, right? The rules don't say tie goes to the runner. What the rules say is that the batter, okay, is out, right, if the ball does not arrive at the base, they're safe if the ball does not arrive at the base before they do. Okay, that's something like that is the way the rule goes. And so what that implies is that if it happens at the same time, well, then the ball isn't before the runner, and so then the tie would favor the runner. Or the batter in this case. So there's a section of the rules about batters and the circumstances under which they are out or not. There's a separate section of the rules about runners, okay? And the runner says that, in that section, the rules say that the base runner is out, okay, if they don't get to the base before the ball, which indicates that on any of the other bases aside from first base, it seems to indicate that or for somebody who was already on base at the start of a play as opposed to batting at the start of a play, the tie would favor the fielder in those cases. And so it's one of those things where it's a living document. It's changed a lot of times over the years, and nobody, I think, really looked at it with the eye that a logician would look at it. And so, as it turns out, there's also a different section that says that at some point a batter becomes a base runner. But of course, that doesn't mean they cease to become a batter and cease to have the rules for batters apply to them. And so, what that indicates is that somebody can be sort of out and not out at the same time if there is a simultaneous result. Now, this particular logician actually wrote a letter and sent it to Major League Baseball, their rules committee, and the rules committee said, "Oh, that's a very interesting interpretation of the rules." He says, "What do you mean interpretation? The only thing we're interpreting is the meaning of the word before, and that's pretty clear." So and of course he's right. And so then they sort of sent it to the umpires and everything, and the umpires took a look at it and were like, "Nah, there are no ties in baseball," right? That's just what they said. He's like, well, I mean, I can understand, having to sort of operate under that kind of an assumption, but it should be pretty easy just to like reverse one of those formulae and say, fine, whatever, and still have the umpires say, yeah, there's just no real ties, right? You just, make the rules not inconsistent with each other. That would be fine, but no, they're still inconsistent. So, all right. So the idea is, so we might have inconsistent laws here. Also, in terms of gluts, we might have things like self-referential statements, and this is actually something that one of the pioneers of this kind of logic, a guy named Graham Priest, who I've mentioned before, is more interested in. And so things like the liar paradox. And so if you say this sentence is false, right? It's a very famous sort of a thing. And so notice that sentence is false if it's true. Okay. Right. So if the sentence is true, then it's false because what it says is that it's false. And if the sentence is false, okay, well then it's true, right? Because if it says it's false, then it's saying something true. And so it's a very strange paradox. And so you might call that kind of a sentence a glut. Okay. This is closely related to Russell's paradox, which is another fun paradox. Russell put it this way. He was really describing a paradox in Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, but he used this as an example to explain the paradox, right? So he says the barber is defined as, quote, one who shaves all those and those only who do not shave themselves. And then the question is, does the barber shave himself? So answering this question results in a contradiction either way. The barber cannot shave himself, as he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. And as such, if he shaves himself, he ceases to be a barber. But if the barber does not shave himself, then he fits into a group of people who would be shaved by the barber, and so as the barber needs to shave himself, right? So that's again, it's an example of kind of self-referential paradox. There are many paradoxes of self-reference, and if you want to talk about those things in a way that just sort of acknowledges their paradoxical nature, perhaps you want to call such statements gluts. So here's a picture of Graham Priest here with the really awesome Hell's Logicians t-shirt. I want to get me one of those, but I don't think I'm just not as high-powered enough figure in logic to really pull that off, I don't think, right? But even though it's awesome, okay? So anyway, it may be the case that there are sentences that are both true and false. So you could have a three-valued logic where true and true only is what T means, false and false only is what F means, and both true and false, which is this G here. So G now stands for glut instead of gap, okay? And so again, it's a three-valued logic with T, F, and G in it. And the kind of paradox or the kind of logic we're going to look at is sometimes called the logic of paradox. That's what Graham Priest calls it. A lot of other people just call it a Priest logic, right? After the guy who has done really the most work in that. And so this is what LP semantics is. And if you're like really paying attention, you'll notice, oh my goodness, that's the same as K3 semantics, right? Cool, right? If you notice that, but if you didn't, I'm pointing it out. It's the same as K3 semantics. It's just that the G actually means something different, right? So all the things we said before. So the idea is that something the or, right? So if something is for example, both true. If P is both true and false, then its negation is also both true and false, right? Or you might say both false and true in that sense. So it's still gap. It's still glutty, right? And again, you've got the wedge, which is going to treat anything that's true or or gappy, or sorry, true or glutty as true, okay, and anything that is or at least one half of which is true as true, and the only time it's going to be false is when sort of both are false, right? And then of course with the and, the only time it's true is when both are true, and then it's sort of either gappy or false otherwise. And then of course the conditional does what it does. All right, so the law of excluded middle is a theorem of LP semantics, right? Because it always comes out as either true and true only or true and false. And so in some sense, it's always true, right? Um, However, the law of non-contradiction doesn't end up necessarily false because it comes out as either false and only false or as both true and false, right? So sometimes it's not necessarily false, right? It's sometimes true and false, right? And so again, that's the whole point of LP semantics, is to allow for cases of contradiction, right? To really be in the system. And so, you know, we get the law of excluded middle, we deny the law of non-contradiction. That's how we generate the system. But unfortunately, modus ponens is invalid in LP. So that might bother you. You might say, well, gosh, modus ponens is so basic as a pattern of reasoning that that's gotta be valid. But in LP, it isn't valid. Okay, and if that bothers you, and I think it should, then you can alter, right, the conditional function of LP in the following way. This is a little layer, by the way. So in these cases here, where you know, P is true and Q is gappy, or where P is gappy and Q is false, instead of glutty, sorry, not gappy, where the result here says that the conditional is glutty, we can instead change that to that conditional then being false in those cases. Okay, and then what you get when you make that change, you're not in LP anymore, you're in a different system. That system is referred to as RM3 semantics, which stands for R mingle 3 valued, and the R stands for a relevance logic, you know, the R stands for relevance, etc. So this is the point at which, again, both in the text and here, I'm going to sort of trail off and say, yeah, there's weeds. Okay, there's big tall weeds to get totally lost in, and I encourage you to do so if you're interested. Okay, and so the last thing I want to talk to you about is metalogic, because that's the one more extra thing that we don't really cover in a first year course, but that it's absolutely out there and it's fascinating. And I want to talk to you about one of the most well-known, or at least sort of often referred to results of metalogic, and that is Gödel's incompleteness proofs. I mean, lots of people will sometimes bring these up or use them for, you know, goodness knows what, sometimes accurately, very often suspiciously, but the idea is that, yeah, you should know something about what Gödel's incompleteness proofs really do say, and I'm going to try and go through this with as little technicality as possible, because again, I haven't introduced you to any ideas in metalogic, because I kind of don't think you should do that in a first year logic course. Although if you can, great. I mean, I just don't. I think that's a second logic course kind of a thing in my view. Okay, and so this is Kurt Gödel, one of those lucky folks with an umlaut in the name. Okay, and he published his incompleteness theorems in 1931 at the age of 25. And this is one of those things where I think, like, to make like a really serious like innovation in sort of logic or mathematics or chess for that matter, you generally have to show a lot of promise at a fairly early age. I don't know that that's an iron law or something, but it certainly seems to be the case, right? So if you haven't proved some major new theorem by the time you're 30, you probably won't, right? Like, you know, I certainly I'm you know, I'm old, right? By my age, if I haven't like made a major contribution to logic, it's unlikely that I will. Not impossible, but unlikely. You know, just like it's unlikely that, you know, because I was not a chess master at the age of, you know, like 17 or something, or even earlier, it's not likely that I will at this point. Okay, so there's some overlap there. Okay. And so Gödel, though, was absolutely a wunderkind, right? You know, as a sort of boy wonder of lot, and he's absolutely one of the most important logicians ever, having delivered us one of the most important logical results ever in this incompleteness. So a little bit of background is necessary, though, to understand what Gödel was up to and about, and why his result was so important. So back in the day, when people wore hats like this, this is a picture of David Hilbert, right? Who's a very important mathematician. If you've taken a lot of course about the history of mathematics, you'll certainly have come across that name. Hilbert was a German mathematician, and he issued a challenge to mathematicians in sort of late 19th, early 20th century to try and put the whole field of mathematics onto a solid logical foundation, right? So there's certainly people doing stuff with math, but it wasn't like there was some kind of unified system, right? Where everyone sort of agreed, okay, here are the logical bases upon which we build all of these concepts in mathematics. That was something that was, sort of being worked out. There were absolutely some revolutions in formal logic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is the period of time during which Russell was working. Gottlob Frege was an important figure in this period. Vilfredo Peano, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of people at about this time really working on fusing mathematics and logic and really putting mathematics on a solid logical foundation. It's considered a very important topic there. And one of the reasons it's so important is, because in recognition of it, Hilbert issues sort of a set of challenges, right? He says, okay, here are the projects, right, that are the big major projects. And people took that very seriously, and it had a major influence on what people were doing in sort of advanced and theoretical mathematics and in logic at the time. And so it became called, right, this idea became called the Hilbert Program. Again, it was a big deal. Okay. And so the Hilbert program is something like this. He wanted a formalization of all mathematics. In other words, he wanted all mathematical statements should be written in a precise formal language and manipulated according to well-defined rules. He thought that was very important. So in a sense, defining all the exact rules of the formal systems of mathematics, right? That was important to Hilbert because to some degree, a lot of that was convention, but not necessarily a really rigorous, logically defined structure, right? And so he also wanted completeness. He wanted a proof that all true mathematical statements can be proven in that formal system, right? So he wanted a complete system. And he also wanted a consistent system, okay? That is, he wanted a proof that no contradiction can be obtained in the formalism of mathematics, right? And the consistency proof should be preferably, right, use only what he called finitistic reasoning about finite mathematical objects. Again, there's some weeds there to get into, and I'm not going to. So he wanted conservation, right? This is the idea that a proof that any result about real objects obtained using reason about ideal objects, such as uncountable sets, can be proved without using ideal objects. Again, a lot of jargon in there, a lot of weeds, and I'm going to go by it. And decidability, right? He says there should be an algorithm for deciding the truth or falsity of any mathematical statement. So in a sense, anything that can be said about the truth or falsity of a mathematical statement should be able to be said by a computer. That's how we would put it now. Okay, we would say it has to be in this sort of rule-based system where you can just sort of follow a procedure and get the right result. Okay, very much like our truth tables or our semantic trees or something like that, where if you just follow the rules, you can get the proper result. Okay, and so that's essentially what decidability is. And so I want to talk about two really important notions in metalogic that we're going to focus on for our purposes. So one of those is what we call soundness for the most part in metalogic. Hilbert called it consistency on the previous page, and also what we call completeness. Okay, so soundness says that a logical system, like for example our propositional calculus, language S, or our predicate calculus, language P, is a sound system if and only if it never proves anything that's wrong. Okay, so that means that every proof indicates a truth. So any time you can prove that an argument is valid, you know it actually has to be valid. Like if you can use S to prove it's valid, you know it has to be, right? So that's any sound system will be one where that's the case, where it's not going to tell you something is sound if it isn't, right? It's not going to tell you something is consistent if it isn't, right? Or valid, excuse me, right? So it's not going to tell you something is equivalent if it isn't, right? So that's soundness, right? And so notice every proof that you can do in S or P can be checked by a truth table or a semantic tree, right? And so S and P are provably sound, although, of course, we should also need a proof for the soundness of the truth table system and the tree system, right? And that's, more metalogic. A logical system is complete if and only if it can prove everything that is right, okay? These are two very easy things to sort of get confused with each other. And I think the best way to keep them separate is to think of it this way. So a sound system is one where every proof indicates a truth, okay? And in the complete system is one where every truth has a proof in the system, okay? So the soundness says that like everything the system can do, it does correctly. And this one says that everything it's possible to do correctly, the system can do. All right, that's the difference between soundness and completeness. Gödel is actually going to have something interesting to say about the completeness of something like, say, P, right, the predicate calculus. Now, here's a little bit of an aside. This is I think this is Giuseppe Peano, an Italian economist, who developed this system called Peano Arithmetic, and you don't really we don't really need to say anything about Peano Arithmetic, even though we are doing so anyway, to understand the nature of Gödel's proof, but it's the system that Gödel used as his example, and so here it goes, right? So Peano Arithmetic is a system for proving things, just like our propositional or predicate calculus, but it proves things about natural numbers instead of sentences or propositions. That's what Peano Arithmetic is for, is to talk about numbers. And so the axioms, the proof rules of Peano Arithmetic are that 0 is a number, okay? That if A is a number, the successor of A is a number. Do you see this notion of functions doing a very important role here? 0 is not the successor of a number, okay? And that two numbers of which the successors are equal are themselves equal, right? And so again, this is a way of defining things in terms of functions, and you'll see that your recursion is going to play a major role in making these things work. It's really a genius kind of a system. So the induction axiom is what they call that, says that if a set S of numbers contains 0 and also the successor of every number in S, then every number is in S, right? That's just a way of enumerating the set of natural numbers. And so because Gödel was dealing with this set of axioms for facts about natural numbers, these Peano axioms, and since he intended his results to be of general importance to the foundations of mathematics, he needed a way to encode any formal system into natural numbers, right? And so this is where what Gödel uses Peano for generally. This system of encoding is called Gödel numbering, and there's an infinite number of acceptable ways to do it. All it requires is that each element of the formal system have some unique numerical representation, and that you can turn the numerical representation back into the notation of the formal system, right? I'll give you an example of that, because in the abstract it may not make as much sense as it could. So Gödel himself used a thing that's called a prime factoring system, and if you have done a lot in mathematics, especially in things like cryptography and Riemann zeta functions and yada yada yada, then you'll say, oh, I can see why a prime factoring system work well. If you don't see why a prime factoring system would be a sort of a reasonable thing for a mathematician to use, don't worry about it. It's not that important for our purposes. But again, a substitution code would work just as well and is more comprehensible to non-mathematicians. By non-mathematicians, I mean people who don't do serious work in the theory of mathematics, right? I mean, everybody's a mathematician in the sense that they can like add, right? Or nearly everybody. So for example, the sentence A and B, right? So if we take this in our formal system, A and B, right? It could be encoded as 102702, where 1 represents A, 2 represents B, 27 represents and breaks between characters are coded with 0. Now, of course, you say, okay, what's the difference between the 2 and the 27? Well, that's going to be, you're going to have to figure out a way to notate that, and that's one of the things that prime factoring helps with. But you see the idea, right? You see the idea that you can substitute things for numbers and then substitute the numbers back for the things. That's all that Gödel numbering really means. And so it's not only sentences that can be encoded this way, but then whole proofs. You can encode a whole proof as a string of numbers, okay? And that's the important part of what Gödel numbering can do. It's very sort of powerful, right? And so this process has the effect of meaning that we can talk about any formal system by talking about numbers, and because the Peano axioms allow us to talk about numbers, then we can use the Peano axioms to talk about any formal system, and that's essentially why Gödel used them as how he used them. And so we don't actually need to use Gödel numbers to explain the basic movement of the proof, and so for simplicity, I'll just move on and say that if you look up Gödel's proofs and get all this stuff about Gödel numbering and say, my logic professor didn't say anything about that, well, now you can't say that. You can say I did say something about Gödel numbers, even if you wouldn't be able to really read some of these proofs, which is, not without a lot of prep, and that's fine. So the famous part of Gödel's proof is what he calls his Diagonal Lemma, okay? And his proof will not actually apply to all formal systems, but only formal systems with certain properties. And these properties are specified by the Diagonal Lemma. In some formal systems, we get codes for sentences that express facts about themselves. Okay, so any logical system that is powerful enough to express facts about itself is going to be one of these that Gödel is going to be talking about and interested in. So for example, we don't have such machinery in S. In S, we can't, like, it can't talk about itself, okay, but we do in P. So consider the predicate blank has property P, okay? And the constant this sentence, right? And we can represent this sentence as property P in the predicate calculus as, capital P, lowercase s. And that would have its own Gödel number, okay? That's the important part to remember about this. Okay, so depending on what property P is, some sentences with the code capital P lowercase s, or whatever Gödel number that would be, will be true, and some of those will be false. So for example, if I say this sentence is a sentence, right? If property P is a sentence, well then obviously this sentence is a sentence is true. It is. That is a sentence, right? This is, that's a sentence. Okay, that's true. This sentence is a proof. Okay, that's false. Okay, so if property P is a proof, okay, well then you know, capital P lowercase s is false. Okay, great. So far so good. So consider then the sentence. This sentence is not provable in the predicate calculus, that is in our language P. Okay, so this sentence is not provable in the predicate calculus. So that's language P along with, you know, our proof rules or our tree rules or whatever. So this sentence, we're just going to call this the G sentence. Okay, the sentence that instead of saying this whole sentence, we're just going to replace it with a capital G. Okay, that's our Gödel sentence. Okay, the Gödel sentence is, this sentence is not provable in this system, in this case, the predicate calculus. So the diagonal lemma of Gödel's proof says that you get a Gödel sentence in every formal system that can have sentences that express facts about themselves. So if you're talking about piano arithmetic, you say, this sentence is not provable in piano arithmetic. Okay, that's the way whatever, that's your Gödel sentence in that system. If you have, like, say, you know, Kripke's semantics, you know, like, you know, K semantics for you know, modal logic, you can, the Gödel sentence in that kind of a system says, this sentence is not provable in K semantics, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So and Gödel's right intuitively, that any system that can say something about itself can say, quote, this sentence is not provable in insert system here. Okay, so any system that can say something like that is going to have a Gödel sentence in it. And so now we want to prove that the Gödel sentence is actually true. Okay, and we're going to do that using a reductio. So first off, assume that the Gödel sentence, remember the sentence that reads, this sentence is not provable in the predicate calculus, assume that it's not true. Okay, so we're going to assume it is not true that this sentence is not provable in the predicate calculus. Okay, that's the way you always start an RAA, is you assume, you make an assumption, right? You assume the opposite of what you intend to prove. If G is false, okay, if the Gödel sentence is false, then it must be provable in the predicate calculus, because if it's not true that G is not provable, then it's provable. Okay, that's, you know, simple double negation, right? If a different proof then will show that the predicate calculus is sound, okay, which, remember, that it, you know, means that it never proves anything that is false. So that's one of those things we haven't gone over. I haven't gone over the proof that the predicate calculus is sound. That means that everything that it does prove is actually true, okay? And you can prove that, right? There are many proofs of the soundness of something like the predicate calculus. And so at that point, you sort of import that into your proof. Say, oh, look, but whenever you know, our predicate calculus proves something, it's true, okay? And so because G is provable in the predicate calculus, and the predicate calculus is sound, then G is true. Okay, remember, so either G is sort of true and not true, right? Or else the predicate calculus is sound and unsound. So the assumption that G is not true generates a contradiction, which means that G, of course, must be true. Remember, because we assumed it was false, and then we got a contradiction, so now we must assume that it's in fact true. And so if G is true, that means it is unprovable in predicate calculus. And it's true. It's true that it's unprovable in the predicate calculus. Okay. Again, slow down and go over this a couple of times to try and get your head wrapped around it. Okay. So again, remember, if our Gödel sentence is true, then it is not provable in the predicate calculus, because the capital letter G just stood for the sentence. This sentence is not provable in the predicate calculus. Okay. So it's provably true, actually, that the sentence is not provable. We have proven that it's not provable. Okay. That's the real target of what's interesting here. Okay, so if G is true but not provable in the predicate calculus, then something is true and not provable in the predicate calculus. And if there is something that is true and not provable in the predicate calculus, then the predicate calculus is incomplete. Remember, a complete system is one that for every truth, right, there is a proof, right? Soundness means that for every proof is a truth, okay? And completeness means that every truth should have a proof in the system. But if the Gödel sentence is provably true, okay, and yet what's true is that it's not provable in the predicate calculus, then there's something that is both true, right, and not provable. And if there's something that's true and not provable in the predicate calculus, then it must be incomplete. Okay, so this is not saying that for all we know, right, there is, there could be, truths that aren't provable in the system. No, we have proven that. Okay, that's and so here's a proposal. Okay, it says, how about we just add G as a rule to the existing rules of predicate calculus, right? Just say, okay, look, let's just add a rule. Let's say that the Gödel sentence is sort of simply true, right? Just add it to the rules of predicate calculus, so we can say, okay, well, it's in the system now. So what we would do is we would end up with a new formal system, okay? So our old formal system is defined by the rules that it has, but if we add a rule, then we're actually creating a new formal system. And it has all the rules of the predicate calculus in it, plus a rule for the Gödel sentence. And so let's call this new system PC+G. So that's predicate calculus plus Gödel sentence, right? Or the Gödel rule, however we want to phrase it. And so PC+G is every bit as versatile as the predicate calculus. And so adding the rule for the Gödel sentence does not make the system unsound. And so it still never proves anything that is false. And so that we can use the PC+G system to generate the sentence G prime. Okay, and the sentence G prime says this sentence is not provable in PC+G. Okay, so we can get a new Gödel sentence in this new formal system. And again, consider using a reductio, and this will look for a minute. Let's assume that G prime is not true, that it's not true that this sentence is not provable in predicate calculus plus Gödel rule. If G prime is false, then G prime is provable in PC+G. Okay. And a different proof will show that PC+G is sound, which is we can totally do that. And because G prime is provable in PC+G and PC+G is sound, then G prime is true. And so either, again, we have either G is true and not true, or else PC+G is sound and unsound. So the assumption that G prime is not true generates a contradiction, which means that G prime must be true. Okay, so we've proven that G prime is true in PC+G. And if that's the case, then it is not provable in PC+G. Okay, and if G prime is true but not provable in PC+G, then something is true and not provable in PC+G. And if there is something that is true and not provable in PC+G, then PC+G is incomplete. So how about we just add G prime as a rule to the existing rules of PC+G, and then give us a new formal system, PC+G plus G prime, right? Okay, right? Yeah, look, it should be pretty clear that by now that what Gödel has proved is that no formal system that is fine-grained enough to talk about itself can be complete. I mean, just think it's mind-blowing. Again, I want to draw a distinction between what we think might be going on and what's actually going on here. Right? This is worth emphasizing. He has not demonstrated that we just don't know whether any formal system is complete, right? That would not be a new result. He has proved, okay, that any formal system of a certain kind can't be complete, right? Again, any formal system that can say something about itself cannot be a complete system, because any such system would contain a Gödel sentence, and a Gödel sentence is provably true in the system. And if it's provably true, then remember the sentence just says this sentence is unprovable in the system. So we can prove that it's actually true, and so we can prove that it's true and unprovable. And so if there's something that is true and unprovable, then the system is incomplete. And so he said, like, look, any system, no matter how what kind of system, no matter what you do to it, if it's complicated enough to say something about itself, then it's incomplete. Right? That's a tremendously interesting result. And again, it tends to be misused by some various people here and there in very suspicious ways, but that's essentially the insight. So I want to wind things up by just saying that saying thanks for coming along on this wild ride. I hope you've gotten a sense in which a sense of all of it's possible, right? And I hope you've noticed, because sometimes things change slow enough that it's hard to notice, but I hope you'll at some point notice the kind of benefits of really retraining your mind to think very explicitly about logic, about, under what conditions things really mean other things, right? Or what under what conditions certain sets of ideas are consistent or not, etc. And how to go about figuring those things out in a way that is organized, that's visualized properly, and that's, beyond a doubt. Okay, and that's one of the great things that logic can give us. So I will say that as you've sort of retrained your brains to do this, you will find yourself at some point in the future looking at something and saying, I'm pretty sure that like a formal treatment of logic could actually understand this thing or that thing better, and so I'm going to go ahead and try and use that. You'll see all kinds of opportunities to use some of the insights about the formal systems of logic in all kinds of different places. And sometimes you'll come across things that you're like, well, this is a tricky case. I'm really not sure how to handle this. And I do encourage you to consider me to be something of a lifetime resource in terms of that. Like really, if you get in touch with me at some time, like 5 years from now and say, hey, I ran into this thing that I kind of think that logic could really apply to, and I'm not really sure how it does. I'm always happy to help. So that's I hope that goes without saying, but in case it doesn't, I'm saying it. So anyway, thanks a whole bunch, and best to you all as you continue on through your academic and otherwise and other sorts of lives.